There's a quiet hum in the world, not of machinery, but of men. Men who rise with the sun and work until it sets, their shoulders often bowed, their minds often elsewhere. They are the bedrock, the unspoken foundation of every family, every town, every ambition that gets built. And for too long, too many of them walk through life like shadows, just a part of the background, unseen, unheard, never truly followed. Not because they lack the strength of an ox or the heart of a lion, but because somewhere along the way, they forgot how to cast their own light. They wait for someone else to step up, to point the way, to make the call. They figure leadership is for the loud ones, the ones with fancy titles, or the ones born with silver tongues. And so the world rolls on, driven by a few, while a multitude of good men just keep their heads down, their potential gathering dust like an old toolbox in the corner of a forgotten garage. They spend their days being led without ever considering the quiet power of leading themselves. Hector was one such man. 42 years old, built like a brick wall that had taken a few too many blows, he was a factory worker at the Northside automotive plant. His world was the rhythmic clang and hiss of the machines, the metallic tang in the air that never quite left your clothes, even after a hot shower. Every morning, his hands, calloused and thick as oak roots, found their way to the steel levers and greasy components. They were hands that knew the ache of a 12-hour shift, the sting of a fresh cut, the smooth, cold reassurance of a well-oiled tool. They were hands that built things, sturdy and true, but rarely anything beyond what was on the production schedule. His face, usually a canvas of quiet determination, bore the subtle etching of fatigue around his eyes that had seen more long shifts than starry nights. They were the eyes of a man who observed, who took in every detail of the assembly line, every flicker of a faulty gauge, but rarely offered an opinion unless directly asked. His hair, a salt and pepper mix, was always neat, brushed back with a discipline that mirrored his approach to work. He moved with a practiced economy, no wasted motions, just efficient, reliable effort. He wasn't loud, never one for the boisterous locker room jokes or the lunchtime gossip. He was the kind of man you could set your watch by, dependable as the sunrise, but just as predictable. He kept to himself, a solitary island in the clamor of the factory floor, a man content or perhaps resigned to blending in. There was a gruffness about him, not mean-spirited, but more like the worn bark of an old tree, tough, protective, and not inviting to casual touch. He was a pillar of the team in his own way, always there, always doing his part, but never seeming to push, to strive for anything beyond the day's task. He was the sturdy, unmoving anchor, rather than the sail that caught the wind. The silence that followed him felt less like a choice and more like a heavy cloak he wore, shielding whatever was stirring underneath from the eyes of the world. He was, to anyone looking from the outside, just another working man, strong and true, yet indistinguishable from the thousands of others who walked the same path. That man was Hector, 42 years old, and though he hadn't sought out the spotlight, it had also never sought him. He carried the weight of his years not just in the slight stoop of his shoulders, but in the quiet knowing that settled in his gaze, a man whose identity was forged in the predictable heat and clang of the factory. Every morning the world started for Hector at 5:05. Not 5 o'clock sharp, never 5:10. 5:05 precisely when the alarm on his bedside table buzzed, a low, persistent hum against the quiet of the pre-dawn house. He didn't curse it, didn't slam the snooze. He simply opened his eyes, a practiced, almost involuntary act like a machine powering up. Sarah, his wife, would stir beside him, a soft sigh escaping her lips, but she wouldn't truly wake. She knew Hector's rhythm. She de-learned to sleep through it. He swung his legs out of bed, the worn linoleum cool beneath his bare feet. The old house, a modest single-family place in a working-class suburb, groaned faintly with the shift in temperature, or perhaps just from age. It needed a fresh coat of paint, a new section of guttering little things that sat on a mental list Hector kept, a list that seemed to grow faster than he could chip away at it. Downstairs, the kitchen was a dim rectangle of shadows. He'd flick on the weakest light, just enough to find the coffee pot. He liked the ritual. The precise scoop of grounds, the gurgle of water, the rich, earthy smell that filled the air, the first real sign that the day had begun. While it brewed, he'd toast 2 slices of stale bread, slather on some cheap jam. No time for anything fancy. Not for him anyway. Emily, his 14-year-old, would be waking soon for school, and Michael, 10, would need a good breakfast before his day started. Their needs came first always. That was the unspoken contract of his life. By 5:40, he was pulling out of the driveway in his 15-year-old pickup truck, the engine grumbling its discontent. The drive to the plant was a familiar blur of streetlights and silent houses, the city slowly rousing itself around him. He'd passed the same diner, the same early bird commuters, each trapped in their own loop. He wasn't special. He was part of the loop. The factory gates loomed, a monstrous iron grin in the morning gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of machinery, the faint scent of stale oil, and a pervasive low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor and deep into his bones. His station was on the main assembly line, Section C, fitting housings onto engine blocks. Day in, day out. The same bolts, the same torque wrench, the same rhythmic thunk-clunk as each block slid into place. His hands, precise and tireless, moved with an almost surgical grace, each motion ingrained from thousands of repetitions. He could do it in his sleep, and sometimes he felt like he was. The clock on the wall, a vast, round face above the din, seemed to crawl. Every tick was a drop of time, slowly filling a bucket that would overflow only at quitting time. Lunch was a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, eaten in silence beside the whirring of a massive ventilation fan, occasionally nodding at a fellow worker, rarely exchanging more than a grunt or a brief, tired observation about the weather. Then it was back to the line. More thunk-clunk, more bolts, more housings. He kept his head down, focused. He knew the numbers, the quotas, the endless push for efficiency. He just did his part reliably without fuss. The bills piled up on the kitchen counter at home. The mortgage, Emily's braces, Michael's new shoes, the persistent need for that paint job. Every bolt tightened, every housing secured was another small chip at that mountain of debt. Another day his family would have a roof over their heads and food on the table. It wasn't a glamorous reason, but it was a damn good one. And for Hector, it was the only one that mattered. He wasn't looking for glory. He was just trying to make it to tomorrow. Whistle shrieked, a welcome siren splitting the factory's constant rumble, signaling the end of another shift. Hector cleaned his tools with practiced motions, hung his safety glasses, and joined the slow-moving current of tired men heading for the exit. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and damp earth, a stark contrast to the grease and metal tang of the plant. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets, the radio a low drone of classic rock that he barely registered. His modest single-family house, a quiet sentinel in the working-class suburb, came into view. The porch light was already on, a beacon against the fading light, and he could see the faint glow of the television through the living room window. He pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and for a moment just sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled. Another day done. Another day exactly like the one before it. Inside, Sarah would be in the kitchen, the comforting aroma of whatever she'd cooked for dinner already filling the air. Emily, his 14-year-old, probably hunched over homework or lost in her phone, and Michael, 10, likely sprawled on the living room rug, captivated by some cartoon. Hector would walk in, offer a quiet, "Hey!" kiss Sarah on the cheek, maybe ruffle Michael's hair, and then head for the bathroom to wash the day's grime from his hands and face. Dinner was usually a quiet affair, a scattering of questions about school, quick answers about work, a shared moment of calm before the evening settled in. He'd watch his kids, their faces still so full of innocent possibility, and feel the familiar squeeze in his chest, a mix of deep love and annoying dread that he wasn't giving them enough, that he wasn't being enough. He'd catch Sarah's eye sometimes, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared weariness that didn't need words. They were doing okay, surviving. But survival, he often thought, wasn't the same as living. Later, after the kids were in bed and Sarah had drifted off beside him, Hector would lie awake in the quiet darkness. The house creaked, the refrigerator hummed, and his own thoughts became a steady, relentless hum in his head. He'd stare up at the ceiling, the shadows playing tricks on the plaster, and sometimes, for a brief, fleeting moment, he'd see another path, another version of himself. A younger Hector, full of a different kind of fire, who had once imagined a life with purpose, with a voice that mattered, with something more to offer than just reliable labor. That younger Hector with dreams of inventing something, of fixing things in a bigger way, of being a man who built instead of just assembled. Where had he gone? He was buried deep down under layers of routine, under the weight of bills and responsibilities, under the constant, monotonous thrum of the factory floor. He felt a deep-seated frustration with his stagnation, a quiet yearning for respect and purpose beyond just clocking in and out. It was a dull ache, always present, like a bad tooth you just learned to live with. He doubted his own ability to inspire change, to even speak change. He'd seen things at the plant, inefficiencies, minor safety issues, better ways of doing things, but the words always caught in his throat. What was the point? They wouldn't listen to him. He was just Hector. Another cog in the machine, and cogs didn't have opinions, they just turned. His voice didn't matter. His ideas didn't matter. He'd learned to observe rather than act, to see the problems and silently log them away, assuming it wasn't his place to fix them. Someone else would. Someone important would. He was invisible, unheard, and he had, in his quiet way, accepted it. But sometimes, when the silence was deepest, a flicker of hope would ignite, a tiny spark in the vast, dark emptiness. A whispered question: what if? What if his voice did matter? What if he wasn't just another cog? The thought would shiver through him, a jolt of something he hadn't felt in years, quickly followed by the crushing weight of reality. The fear of stepping out, the fear of ridicule, the fear of failing. He'd sigh, turn over, and try to find sleep, pushing the troublesome thoughts back into their silent corners. Tomorrow would be another day on the line, another day to keep his head down, another day of just making it through. The shift started like any other. The metallic tang of oil and sweat filled the air, the rhythmic clang and hiss of machines, a familiar, grinding lullaby. Hector was on the press line, feeding sheets of steel into the maw of the behemoth, his movements precise, practiced, almost robotic. His mind, however, was elsewhere, half listening to the radio chatter of the morning show, half drifting to the grocery list Sarah had left on the fridge. Then came the jolt. Not a sudden stop, but a subtle, sickening lurch from the old Model 7 die-caster down the line. It was the same machine he'd eyed weeks ago, noticed the worn coupling, the way it sometimes shuddered an extra beat before cycling. He'd even made a mental note to mention it, maybe to Foreman Dave, but then dismissed it. Not my problem. Dave sees everything. Someone else will get to it. That familiar refrain, a worn-out record in his head. Today, though, the shudder didn't stop. It escalated. A high-pitched whine, like a banshee trapped in metal, tore through the factory din. Head snapped up. Hector froze, watching, a cold dread snaking up his spine. Young Miguel, barely out of trade school, was loading a fresh mold into the machine's jaws. He was new, eager, still a little green. Too green to hear the warning signs Hector had already dismissed. The whine crescendoed into a guttural roar, then a violent explosion of steam and shredded metal. A sickening crack. The safety guard, usually a thick shield of reinforced glass, buckled inward, shattering. Miguel cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. The boy stumbled back, clutching his arm, a dark stain blossoming on his sleeve. The machine, still groaning, spewed coolant onto the concrete floor, a toxic puddle spreading like spilled blood. In a heartbeat, chaos erupted. Shouts, frantic rushes, the piercing wail of the emergency alarm. But for Hector, in that frozen moment, all he saw was Miguel's pale face, twisted in agony, and the mangled arm. He saw the broken machine, heard the echoes of that long-ago whine, the one he had heard, he had seen, he had ignored. Nausea hit him, stronger than any fatigue. Not just fear, but a searing, soul-deep shame. His inaction, his silence, his "not my place" excuse, it all coalesced into a heavy, suffocating weight. He was complicit. He had seen the problem, had felt the uneasy tremor in his gut, and he had done nothing. He had waited for someone else to step up, for someone else to fix it, and a kid had paid the price. The metal taste of guilt filled his mouth. This wasn't just a bad day. This was a chasm opening up beneath his feet. That night, sleep was a cruel joke. The house was quiet, Sarah and the kids long since asleep, their gentle breathing a stark contrast to the cacophony still echoing in Hector's mind. He was in the living room, a cheap beer sweating in his hand, the TV muted, its blue glow illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. The clock on the mantelpiece read 3:17 a.m. He closed his eyes, but it was worse. He saw Miguel's face again, heard that terrible cry. He saw the fractured safety guard, the steam, the spreading coolant. His stomach twisted. He tried to push it away, to bury it like all the other discomforts, but this one wouldn't budge. This one had roots that burrowed deep. "You idiot!" he muttered to the empty room, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "You absolute idiot!" He wasn't talking about Miguel or the plant foreman. He was talking about himself. For years, he'd believed his quietness was a strength, a way to avoid trouble, to just get by. But what had it gotten him? A life of invisible servitude. A quiet weariness that had settled into his bones. He told himself his voice didn't matter, that he was just a cog. But Miguel's pain, that shattered arm, it screamed a different truth. His voice could have mattered. His observation could have prevented it. His inaction had been a choice, a silent betrayal of his own conscience. He stared at his hands, calloused, scarred, strong from years of labor. What had they built? What had they protected? He'd built a modest house. He'd de-built a modest house, provided for his family, sure. But what about the man inside it? The one who used to dream of fixing things, not just operating them. The one who believed in right and wrong, not just policy and procedure. He'd allowed himself to become a shadow, a ghost in his own life, and Miguel had paid the price. A shiver ran through him, colder than any draft. This wasn't just about Miguel anymore. This was about Hector and the silent tomb he'd dug for his own conscience. He looked around the quiet living room at the framed photos on the wall, Sarah's bright smile, Emily's mischievous grin, Michael's gap-toothed triumph with his first lost tooth. What kind of example was he setting? A man who saw wrong and said nothing. A man who hid behind the shield of "it's not my place." "No more," he whispered, the words rasping from his throat, a raw, quiet declaration in the stillness of the night. It wasn't a shout, not an angry roar. It was something far deeper, far more resonant. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, of a quiet man reaching his absolute, undeniable limit. It was an enough. He didn't know what "no more" meant, not exactly. He didn't have a plan, a speech, a strategy. All he knew was that the weight of his own silence had become unbearable. He couldn't go back to being the man who just watched, the invisible man, the man who waited for someone else to point the way. He had to find his own way or drown in this silent shame. The beer lay forgotten, a dull ache beginning to throb behind his eyes, but it was a different kind of ache now, the ache of a soul stirring from a long, deep sleep. The alarm blared at 5:00 a.m. the next morning, slicing through the thin membrane of sleep. Hector hit the snooze button, his hand lingering, his mind a hazy mess of dread and a nascent, unfamiliar resolve. The factory. Today. It felt different already, not just another Monday. It felt like walking into a minefield he himself had helped lay. He went through the motions, coffee, toast, a quick kiss for Sarah before she left for her own early shift at the diner. The usual commute felt charged, every crack in the road, every flicker of a street lamp, a sign. He parked, the familiar drone of the plant already audible, a low hum that usually lulled him into his day's trance. Not today. Today it sounded like a warning. He punched in, the plastic card clicking against the reader, a sound that had always marked the boundary between his world and theirs. Today that boundary felt porous, almost non-existent. As he walked onto the factory floor, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal, he saw it. The same production line, the same machines, the same faces. And there, near the end of his section, was the familiar glint of the older hydraulic press. Not the one that had injured Miguel, that one was still red-tagged, under investigation, but another just as old, just as temperamental. Its safety cage, he noticed, was slightly askew. He'd seen it like that a dozen times, maybe more, always just walked past. A knot formed in his stomach, tight and cold. His palms began to sweat. Just walk past, Hector. Don't start trouble. It's not your job. Someone else will see it. Maybe it's not even that bad. The old whispers, familiar and comforting in their cowardice, began their assault. His head urged him forward into the familiar rhythm of work, to ignore it like he always had. He felt the pull of gravity towards his usual station, the magnetic force of complacency. Then he stopped. He saw Miguel's face, not in the darkness of 3 a.m., but here in the harsh fluorescent light, vivid and accusatory. He felt the searing heat of shame, the bitter taste of complicity. He remembered his whispered, "No more." His feet felt like lead, but he turned, not to his station, but towards the supervisor's office, a glass-walled box overlooking the floor. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to keep his head down, to blend in. This was it. This was the moment. The first, agonizing step away from the life of a silent observer. It wasn't about leading anyone else yet. It was about leading himself out of the dark. Walked past the supervisor's secretary, his heart hammering against his ribs, and knocked on the doorframe of Mr. Davies' office. Davies, a man perpetually stressed and often dismissive, looked up startled. "Hector," Davies said, surprise evident in his voice. Hector never initiated conversation. "Everything all right?" Hector swallowed, his throat dry. "Mr. Davies," he began, his voice rough, unused to the assertion. "That hydraulic press, line 3, the safety cage. It's loose again, been like that for a while off and on." He paused, then added, "It needs to be looked at before someone else gets hurt." The words hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. He hadn't demanded, hadn't preached. He just stated a fact with a quiet conviction that was entirely new. He stood there, unmoving, waiting. For the first time, he wasn't just doing his job. He was doing what was right. Davies merely grunted, rubbing his temples. "All right, Hector. Noted. Maintenance is backed up. We'll put a ticket in." His tone was a well-worn path of dismissal, thinly veiled annoyance at the interruption. Hector just nodded, his jaw tight, and left the office, the weight of the moment settling on him like wet concrete. He hadn't been thanked, hadn't been praised, just a bureaucratic brush-off. The old Hector, the one who kept his head down, screamed, "See, nobody cares. You just made things awkward." Back on the floor, the hum of machinery seemed louder, more indifferent. He felt eyes on him, though no one looked directly. Word spread fast in a factory. Hector spoke to Davies. What would they think? Troublemaker? Brown noser? He kept his head down, each clang of metal a drumbeat of self-doubt. When Sarah asked that night if he'd had a good day, he just mumbled, "Same as always." The weight of his inaction or perceived ineffectiveness pressed down on him. He hadn't changed a thing. He felt like a fool, but the seed was planted, a tiny, stubborn seed. A few days later, he noticed a loose guard on a milling machine, the kind that could snag an arm if you weren't careful. The old Hector would have seen it, maybe even made a mental note to avoid that machine, but never said a word. This time, he hesitated, his stomach clenching. He remembered the look on young Billy's face in the infirmary. Took a deep breath, walked over to the supervisor's station and pointed it out. Not with anger, just with quiet, factual observation. "Guard on the number 4 mill, needs tightening, could be trouble." Again, a grunt, a nod, a promise to look into it. And again, nothing happened for a few days. The guard remained loose. This was the battle, the constant grind against indifference and inertia. He wanted to quit, to sink back into the anonymity of his routine. What's the point? The old voice whispered, "Nobody listens to you. They never have." He saw other men just like him see things and say nothing, their faces mirroring the weariness he knew so well. He almost joined them. One morning, he even walked past a spillage near the loading dock, a clear slip hazard, and kept going. He walked 10 paces, then stopped dead. The image of Billy's face, etched with pain and confusion, burned in his mind. He turned around, grabbed a broom and some sawdust from the corner and cleaned it up himself. No fanfare, just action. A few guys watched him, their expressions unreadable. But he felt a different kind of burn this time, a slow warmth that had nothing to do with shame. Weeks crawled by, each day a small, quiet struggle. He kept speaking up, kept pointing out, kept fixing what he could with his own 2 hands. Sometimes it felt like screaming into a gale. Other times, things did change. That hydraulic press, the one he'd spoken to Davies about. One Tuesday, a new maintenance guy, fresh out of tech school, came by with a toolkit. He tightened the cage, tested it, signed off on it. Hector watched from a distance, a small, private sense of accomplishment blooming in his chest. No one acknowledged it, but he knew the problem was fixed, and he had started it. Then, slowly, subtly, things began to shift. It wasn't a sudden spotlight, not a promotion. It was in the glances, the pauses. Frank, an older machinist with hands like knotted ropes, stopped him one day. "Hey, Hector," he grunted, not looking up from his work. "Heard you got that press fixed, been loose for months. Good job." It was just 2 words, "good job," but they landed like solid weight. Later that week, a younger guy, fresh out of school and still a bit green, was struggling to calibrate a new drill. He fumbled with the manual, frustration growing. Hector, instead of walking past, stopped. "Let me see that, son," he said, not unkindly. He showed the kid a trick, a little shortcut that wasn't in the manual but was learned through years of grease and grime. The kid's gratitude was immediate, genuine. "Thanks, Mr. Hector. That saved me an hour." Hector started listening differently, too. During lunch breaks, he'd find himself drawn into conversations, not just nodding along, but actually hearing the frustrations, the concerns. He'd offer a quiet suggestion, a practical solution based on his years of just being there. He wasn't solving the world's problems, just making the corner of it they occupied a little bit better, a little bit safer, a little bit more efficient. He wasn't loud, but he became steady. And steadiness on a factory floor was a kind of bedrock. Months blurred into a new rhythm. The weary slump in his shoulders seemed to lighten. His eyes, though still lined from years of early mornings, held a different glint, a quiet alertness, a sense of purpose. He still wore the same stained work pants, still punched the same clock. But the man walking through the factory gates each morning was fundamentally different. He didn't become a foreman. He didn't get a corner office. But if there was a problem with a machine, a snag in the workflow, a concern about a new procedure, it wasn't the supervisor people looked to first. They looked to Hector. "Hey, Hector, got a minute?" Someone would call. "What do you think about this?" Another would ask, holding up a faulty part. He wouldn't give speeches. He'd just walk over, his expression thoughtful, his hands instinctively checking the machine, his mind already turning over solutions. He'd listen to the complaint, validate the frustration, and then calmly offer a way forward. He'd mediate small squabbles over tools or shifts, not by asserting authority, but by listening to both sides and finding common ground that made sense for everyone. He wasn't giving orders. He was earning trust, one quiet action, one listen to concern, one consistent stand for what was right at a time. He wasn't just a cog anymore. He was the oil in the gears, the hand on the lever, the watchful eye that made sure the whole damn machine ran a little smoother, a little safer, a little more humanely. At home, Sarah noticed it. He started talking about work again, not just about the numbers or the aches, but about the people, the small victories. He wasn't just a ghost in his own house anymore. He'd help Emily with her math homework, not just watching her struggle. He'd get down on the floor and build Legos with Michael, really building, not just supervising. The weary sigh was replaced by a deeper breath. He was still Hector, the factory worker, but he was also Hector, the man who knew he mattered, who knew his voice, even if quiet, could make a difference. He sat on his porch one evening, watching the last light fade from the sky, a cold beer in his hand. "Used to think someone else would fix things," he mumbled to himself, the words tasting like old dust. "Wait around, keep my head down, then I saw what happens when nobody steps up. Saw it plain as day with Billy. It ain't about being a boss or wearing a title." He took a slow sip. "It's about seeing what's right and just doing it, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. It's about looking out for each other, seeing past your own bench." And back, a faint smile touching his lips. "People listen when you actually care and when you show them you're willing to go first. That's all it ever was. And the truth of it is that's all it ever will be. You see, folks aren't looking for a flag waver or a preacher. They're looking for someone who simply acts, not for glory, but because it needs doing. They're looking for someone to show them what it means to care, to be competent, to have the courage to step into the quiet, everyday breach.